Hello log cabin lovers, this is Dave, and I hope you had a chance to see my video on touring the cabin that I built 37 years ago. And I want to take and make some follow-up videos showing you some of the steps in building a log cabin like this. I'm aiming these videos at novices, people who may not be a professional carpenter or haven't done a tremendous amount of woodworking, and hopefully these films I've broken down into steps that would work for you to try and kind of educate yourself and increase your craftsman skill and take on a project like this. So what I got is, in my basement I made a model. I'm not going to recreate my log cabin, I'm sorry, and build another one, but what I thought is I'd make some videos on hewn logs, and then I made a model here in my basement to kind of show you how the logs get laid up and how I learned some of the things I did that worked very well on the cabin. So this model, the logs are supposed to represent, these are kind of 2x4s, and I ripped them down a little bit so they were tapered like the logs on the cabin, and I even rounded the edges in a couple of spots to represent the rounded top and bottom of the log. Excuse me. The logs in the cabin were 6 inches wide, and everything from 12 to 16 inches in depth. So this is about 1/4 scale from the real cabin. Okay, first of all, before I show you how I laid the logs up, I want to show you some of the devices I put on there that really made building the cabin pretty easy to do for myself, because I was working pretty much by myself all the time. This boom that I made is kind of loosey-goosey looking, but what I did is, when I poured the concrete pads that the cabin is sitting on, I put some rebar in there with a little ring on the top. And when I got ready to start the cabin, I dug a hole in the ground and I put about a 16-foot tall tamarack post in the ground. Then up on the top, I drilled a hole and put about a 1-inch steel shaft in there. It goes through this piece of hewn beam that I'd made, and then I put a post on top of it, put a cable in it, and in essence turned that into a truss. And it's, like I said, all loosey-goosey. You wouldn't think it'd work. But what happens is, when I went to raise a log, I would chain this side of it down, and then on this side, hook a chain around along and put a come-along in the middle, and then run the come-along and lift the log up into place. And you can see it got real rigid when you put some tension on it. Then you could take the chain off, swing this 180, put the chain here, put the come-along on that side, lift that log up, rotate it 90 degrees, do that end, do the other end, and it just worked great. When I'd lift the logs into place, I'd leave the log chain hooked loosely on the log, and it worked as a safety device so the log wouldn't come tumbling off and crush you, because they weighed a lot. They probably, I would guess, weighed anywhere from 1,500 pounds to 2,000 pounds, so they were pretty hefty. Another thing I did is I drilled holes in the logs every so often and dropped pieces of rebar in. You're working with green wood, and the green wood will warp somewhat as it's curing, and so by putting these pins in, the logs can't bulge out or bulge in very much. You don't want to put them in too tight. You don't want to drive them in like a spike. You want the logs to be able to shrink and settle and not bind up on those pins. Another thing I did was I bolted some 2x4s, one on that end, and 2x6s, excuse me, and one on this end with a big bolt through, and when I'd flop them down, when I'd lift the log into place, then I'd flip these up and tighten the bolts up, and I had a nice safety device there to keep the logs from rolling off onto the ground. I would put one down on this end also. Another thing that I needed when I made these log dogs. These represent, probably have 5/8 by 30-inch pieces of iron that I bent about 6 inches on the end and had them sharpen them up. And when you're working with the logs and you get them in place, you put them on and and pound them in a ways, and it really works on those heavy logs to hold it in place while you're sawing and chiseling on them and marking them. So you're going to need a couple of those if you're going to do any kind of work like this. The other thing is, when I built the cabin with green logs, I got a lot of criticism where people said, oh, you can't use green logs, you got to let them cure over the winter, blah, blah, all these reasons. And because they said the logs are going to shrink. Well, I found one good book, and it talked about working with green logs. And what it said is, between the logs, you took blocks of dry wood or rocks, and you can see this is much narrower than the log. This is about like 3 by 3, and you put it in between a 6-inch log, and you kind of drove it into place. And you put a number of them in there. Every so often, like every 6 feet. And what happens then is the logs shrink and they settle. The cabin's settled a couple inches, but the gaps don't change. All the shrinkage takes place in the mass of the log. So when you put the chinking in, even though the log was still green and the log shrunk, the chinking didn't fall out because the gap didn't change. So you see pictures of them when they tear down old log cabins. Lots of times you see all these stones and things between the logs and the mortar. And I thought that was just fill that they put in with the concrete, but really what it was blocks to keep the logs from settling down and crushing the mortar out. When you're working with green logs, it's going to settle. Well, if you put a door in and you pounded spikes through the door casing into the end of the log, then that's going to keep the logs from settling, and the logs are going to shrink and the gaps are going to open up where the chinking was. So this represents a piece of log here, the end of the log if I chainsawed the door opening in. And what I did is I cut a dado in there with the chainsaw, and then I mounted this was a piece of about a 2 by 3 that I put in those mortises, and then you spike your door casing and your window casing to that spline, and so the log can settle and slide up and down along the spline, and it doesn't, the door casing works real well as far as being solid yet letting the log settle. Now, if you didn't have a way to use a chainsaw to cut that groove in, you could take it on the outside of the logs, cut part of the log away on each side so that you could make it very nice and straight up and down, and then take the door casing and fasten your door molding to the door casing and kind of slide it around there like a channel, and that would do the same thing. The logs would be trapped in that channel and be able to slide up and down. Then after a couple of years you could add some more nails if you wanted to through the trim. Any other thing that I can't think of anything other than I'm going to go ahead and start laying up the logs. One of the things, the angles that I cut the dovetails at are about 4 to 1, and that seemed to work for me. And what I did is you take a square and mark a line on a board, and then you go over 1 inch, and then you connect, and then you go up 4 inches on the square line, connect that, and that gives you a 4 to 1 taper. And that seemed to work just fine on the end of the logs. If you go steeper than that, what happens is this part of the tip of that dovetail is kind of weak if it's cut real steep like that, and it would tend to chip off. So 4 to 1 is enough to hold the logs and keep them sliding in, and it's not too much. So somewhere in that vicinity seems to be a good angle. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I marked out and cut the dovetail. This log would be ready to mark to cut the dovetail across it. And when you hold that thing against the logs to mark it, what you got to do is not put it against the log, but put it against a line. Like, here's your first log, so this is your starting point, and you want everything to be plumb with that starting point. No matter what the log, little twists or anything, just always be plumb above that line with a level. And so when you work with this T-bevel square, you can put it even against the side of your level, or follow a light line when you mark the log. So you can put the T-bevel square against that. Go ahead and mark it. Then to figure out how far over, you don't measure the width of the log. What you do is you put the level down on your starting spot down there, get it level up here, and mark the thing all the way up. On this side, you can't see it, but I'm going to do the same thing. And on the inside, that's where I meant to make the mark in the first place. Okay, you mark it up, and then you can connect the dots on the top. All right, and then you would take you can use a chainsaw. When I was in the cabin, I had a real nice buck saw, it was called, and it had coarse teeth, and it worked very well for this. Oh, I forgot to do one step. These lines from this edge over need to be level again. Yeah, I'll turn it level so you can maybe see it. There, that line is level. This line I'm going to have to just guess at it, but there we go. Because I couldn't see underneath there too. Okay, you're going to cut down to those lines. You can cut one side down to the line, then tip, and get the other side down to the line and check it, and make sure you got both of them down where you want to. Then you're going to take a really sharp chisel. I had about a 2-inch one at the cabin, and put it a little above the line for chipping it out. Because if the grain runs downhill, then it's going to make it so low back there that you don't have any room to chisel it off. By doing a little bit shy, then you got room to go back and clean it up with the chisel. And when you're using a chisel on green wood, one of the things is that if you learn to kind of cut on a kitty corner, on a diagonal, then the chisel will cut really smooth, won't dig in, won't shatter, and it's by going on the diagonal a little bit, you can get a smoother cut. Now that's as far as I'm going to take it right now. You get the idea, you take it down to the line, and you got your slope. Now I'm going to switch to the other end and show how you cut the mating part to that. Okay, when you go to, you lay the log on top of the dovetails. I'm not working on this side now because I previously cut that dovetail. Lay the log on top of it. To figure out how far out here it sticks, again, you take the level and you hook it down on your bottom log, and you bring this log out until it's level with that spot. Because again, you want your corners nice and plumb all the way up. So if a log's leaning left or right, and you use that as a basis to square off of, you're going to start having a wavy wall. So always work off that bottom log. Instead of using the log dogs, I got a big clamp on here because the log dog really doesn't work that well on these little lightweight things. Okay, now again, you take the log, and on the sides, you go down to your bottom log and get it all plumbed up. And that's where you're gonna, I'm gonna cheat a little bit because this line is so heavy from this marker. Okay, you bring the line up. On the inside, you do the same thing. Bring the line up. Now, to tell, what you're trying to do is cut a notch in here that matches that angle down there. And to figure out how far up to go, you can take like a dividers or just measure. I think I didn't use a dividers. I think I just measured when I built it originally. And you take the gap. Okay, there's the distance between the logs, but I want a little gap between the logs for the chinking. So, being we're doing 1/4 scale, if I came down about 1/4 of an inch, and that'll leave a 1/4 inch gap down here, which is really about a 1 inch gap on the real log cabin. Then you take that setting and you put it right on top of this bevel, and you mark on that vertical line. Then you go over here and set it on the top of that, the end of the dovetail, and mark that, and go over here, do the same thing, always working on the top, right on the top of the bevel, not on the end of that log. Okay, so I got that all marked out. Then you'd be taking the log and rolling it over up on there, and you would take a straight edge and you would connect the dots. Again, this is going to be maybe a little crude because I'm using a heavy marker so you can see it. I may not be exactly on the mark. There's your duplicate bevel. And then this line can be square across, or you can just connect the dots. Okay. Then you'd be log dogging it down in place. I'm going to use the clamp because it's just such a wobble all around. And I'm going to cut down to that line. Again, I cut down on one side. And if you were using the chainsaw, you'd do the same thing. You'd hold the chainsaw, cut down to this line, cut down to that line, and then slowly go down the last little bit. Now, when I chisel this out, if I can find my chisel. When you chisel this one out, you can go right on the line because the line goes down. There's no chance of the wood grain going down. So I can put the chisel right on the line. And I had a big 2-inch chisel, which I've long since probably sold at a yard sale. And it has to be very sharp to do a good job. Okay, then you can do, oh, I lost my line there. I got one on this side. And I'm going to pare right down to the line. I lost the line on that side, so I'm going to have to just estimate it in. I spoke too soon about it chipping out. On a big log, it's not going to do that because you're working with such a much bigger piece of material. Okay, then you do both ends. You would do both ends. You would do the other end of the log. And this wouldn't be the same setting as this because the log, the gap is probably quite a bit different, so you have to set the calipers down on this end differently than you had them on this end. Now when you roll the log over, it was laying like this. When you roll the log over into the crack, you got those safety boards out here that keep them from tumbling off. Then, okay, I got a pretty darn good fit on that thing. If it was off a little bit, you would remark it, then roll the log back up there and cut it again until it scraped it again. I hope this helps as far as explaining how some of this stuff is done. I hope that some of you that feel like building a log cabin is too difficult for you, I hope you rethink that, because you don't have to have a tremendous amount of skills. You got to have a little bit of patience to get things going. But other than that, I think the average person has plenty of skills to do this. So thanks for watching, and hope I get some other ones posted for you.